November arrived with an early snowfall that blanketed the Triple Crown Ranch in pristine white. Jake woke before dawn to find 3 inches of snow covering his porch, the first real taste of the Montana winter that lay ahead. As he pulled on his boots and jacket, his first thought was of Elena and whether she was prepared for the harsh weather that was now upon them. He need not have worried. When Jake arrived at the barn for morning chores, Elena was already there, feeding the horses and checking water troughs for ice. She wore a heavy coat that looked new, and her cheeks were pink from the cold, but she worked with the same steady determination she'd shown since her first day. "Morning," Jake said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Good morning," Elena replied, her smile warming him more than his thick jacket ever could. "Isn't it beautiful? The way the snow makes everything look clean and new?" Jake looked around the ranch with fresh eyes, seeing it through Elena's perspective. She was right, the snow had transformed the familiar landscape into something magical, softening harsh edges and creating a sense of peace that felt almost sacred. Over the past month, Jake and Elena had fallen into a comfortable routine. They worked together most days, their partnership growing stronger and more natural with each passing week. Elena had proven herself capable of handling any task the ranch required, from mending fence to delivering calves. But, more than her competence, it was her presence that had changed everything for Jake. She had a way of making ordinary work feel meaningful, of finding joy in small moments that he might otherwise have overlooked. When she laughed at something Scout did, when she sang softly in Spanish while grooming horses, when she paused to appreciate a sunset or the sound of wind through grass, these moments had become precious to Jake, bright spots in days that had previously felt routine. This morning, they were assigned to check on the cattle in the north pasture, where the pregnant cows were kept for easier monitoring. The ride through snow-covered fields was quiet and beautiful, their horses' hoofbeats muffled by the white blanket beneath them. Elena rode Rosie with increasing confidence, having mastered the skills of ranch horsemanship over the past weeks. Jake watched her handle the mare with gentle authority, pleased to see how naturally she'd taken to mounted work. She sat tall in the saddle, her movements flowing with the horse's rhythm. "Tell me about winter here," Elena said as they rode. "Is it very harsh?" "Can be," Jake replied. "We'll get snow that lasts for months, temperatures well below zero. The work gets harder, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling hay to pastures, making sure the cattle stay warm and fed." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "On our farm in New Mexico, winter was mild. This will be different for me." "You worried about it?" Jake asked. Elena considered the question seriously, as she did most things. "A little," she admitted. "But I've learned that you can adapt to almost anything if you have good people around you to help." Her words sent warmth through Jake's chest. Over the weeks, he'd watched Elena build relationships with everyone on the ranch, from Mrs. Henderson to the newest part-time hand. She had a gift for making people feel valued and appreciated. But Jake couldn't help hoping that he occupied a special place in her life, that their growing partnership meant something beyond mere friendship. When they reached the cattle, they found most of the herd clustered near the windbreak of trees, taking shelter from the cold. Jake and Elena rode slowly through the group, checking each animal for signs of distress or illness. One of the cows, a young heifer named Daisy, was showing early signs of labor. "We should get her to the barn," Jake said. First-time mothers can have complications, especially in this cold. Working together, they gently separated Daisy from the herd and guided her toward the ranch buildings. It was delicate work that required patience and skill, but Elena seemed to understand instinctively how to move the anxious cow without causing stress. Back at the barn, they settled Daisy in a warm stall with clean straw. Jake called the veterinarian while Elena stayed with the cow, speaking to her in soothing Spanish and keeping her calm. When Dr. Sarah Chen arrived, she was impressed with their preparation and Daisy's relatively relaxed state. "You've got good instincts," Dr. Chen told Elena. "The cow trusts you. That's going to make this much easier." The labor progressed slowly through the afternoon. Jake and Elena took turns staying with Daisy, monitoring her condition and providing comfort. During one of their breaks, they sat in the barn office sharing coffee and sandwiches that Mrs. Henderson had brought out. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning," Jake said quietly. "About having good people around you." Elena looked up from her sandwich, meeting his eyes with that direct gaze that always made his heart skip. "I want you to know," Jake continued, his voice rough with emotion, "that you've got good people here. Not just me, but everyone. I want you to feel like this is home." Something shifted in Elena's expression, a softening that made Jake's breath catch. "I do feel that," she said softly. "More than I expected to when I first arrived. This place, these people, you've made me feel welcome in a way I never hoped for." Before Jake could respond, Dr. Chen called out from Daisy's stall. The calf was coming, and they needed to be ready to assist if necessary. Jake and Elena rushed to help, the intimate moment between them set aside but not forgotten. The birth went smoothly, with Daisy delivering a healthy bull calf just as the sun was setting. Elena knelt in the straw beside the newborn, her face glowing with wonder as she watched the calf take his first breaths. Jake stood behind her, mesmerized not by the miracle of birth, which he'd witnessed many times, but by Elena's reaction to it. "He's perfect," she whispered, tears of joy in her eyes. "Yeah," Jake agreed, but he wasn't looking at the calf. He was looking at Elena, at the way the barn light caught the gold highlights in her dark hair, at the tender expression on her face as she watched new life unfold. Dr. Chen finished her examination and pronounced both mother and calf healthy. "Good work, both of you," she said. "Your quick thinking probably prevented complications." After the veterinarian left, Jake and Elena stayed to make sure Daisy and her calf were settled for the night. They worked quietly together, checking water and feed, adjusting the heat lamps, and ensuring the stall was secure. "I should head to the bunkhouse," Elena said finally, though she seemed reluctant to leave. "Elena," Jake said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Would you like to have dinner at my cabin tonight? To celebrate Daisy's calf? I could cook something proper instead of the usual sandwiches." Elena's eyes widened in surprise, then warmed with pleasure. "I'd like that very much." An hour later, Elena knocked softly on Jake's cabin door. She'd changed into clean jeans and a soft green sweater that brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Jake had spent the time frantically tidying his small home and preparing the best meal he could manage: steak from the ranch's own cattle, roasted potatoes, and green beans from Mrs. Henderson's garden that he'd preserved for winter. "This is lovely," Elena said as she stepped into the cabin. The space was simple but clean, with rustic furniture that Jake had made himself and a few photographs of his family on the walls. Over dinner, they talked more freely than they ever had before. Elena shared stories about her childhood, her dreams of someday having her own small farm again. Jake found himself opening up about his hopes for the future, his love for the land and the animals that depended on him. "I've never met anyone who understands this life the way you do," Jake said as they finished their meal. "The way you care for the animals, respect the work, it's like you were born to it." Elena's cheeks flushed pink. "I feel the same about you. Watching you work, seeing how you treat every animal with kindness and every task with respect, it reminds me of my father. He always said the measure of a person was how they treated those who depended on them." They moved to the small living room, where Jake had built a fire in the stone fireplace. Elena sat on the old leather couch, curling her legs beneath her, while Jake added another log to the flames. The cabin was warm and cozy, filled with the comfortable silence that had become natural between them. "Jake," Elena said softly, her voice uncertain. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," he replied, settling beside her on the couch. "That first day, when you showed me around the ranch, I felt something. A connection, I guess. Did you feel it too?" Jake's heart began to race. This was the conversation he'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I felt it." Elena nodded, relief evident on her face. "I wasn't sure. You're so quiet, so careful with words. I couldn't tell if you were just being kind to the new person." Jake turned to face her fully, gathering his courage. "Elena, I need to tell you something. That first day, when I saw you get out of that old car, something in me recognized you. I don't know how else to explain it. It was like I'd been waiting my whole life without knowing what I was waiting for. Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, but she was smiling. "I felt it too," she whispered. "I thought maybe I was imagining it, but I was so lonely and scared about starting over that I was seeing things that weren't there." "They were there," Jake said, reaching out to take her hand. His calloused fingers intertwined with her smaller, softer ones. "They are there." Elena squeezed his hand, and Jake felt something settle into place inside his chest, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. "I've never felt this way about anyone," Elena admitted. "When I lost the farm, when I had to leave everything I knew, I thought I was just starting over, trying to survive. I never expected to find this." "What is this?" Jake asked softly. Elena met his eyes, and Jake saw in them all the courage and honesty that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "Love," she said simply. "I think this is love." Jake felt his world shift, everything rearranging itself around this one perfect moment. "I love you too," he said, the words coming easier than he'd thought possible. "I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see beauty in everything around you. I love how you make ordinary days feel extraordinary." Elena's smile was radiant, transforming her face with joy. "Really?" "Really," Jake confirmed, lifting their joined hands to press a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Elena leaned closer, and Jake found himself holding his breath as she reached up to touch his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, the same gentle touch she used with frightened animals. "May I kiss you?" she asked softly. Jake's answer was to lean down and meet her halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was tender and sweet and full of promise. It lasted only a moment, but it sealed something between them that words alone could not have accomplished. When they broke apart, Elena rested her forehead against Jake's, both of them breathing unsteadily. "What happens now?" Elena asked. Jake considered the question, thinking about all the practical concerns that would need to be addressed. Where would Elena live? How would their relationship affect their work at the ranch? What would people in town say about the quiet cowboy and the woman who'd appeared in their midst just 2 months ago? But, looking into Elena's eyes, seeing the love and trust reflected there, Jake realized that none of those concerns mattered as much as this moment, this choice they were making to build something together. "Now we take it one day at a time," he said. "We keep working, keep learning about each other. And, when you're ready, when we're both ready, maybe we start making plans for something permanent." Elena's smile was answer enough, but she put it into words anyway. "I'd like that very much." They spent the rest of the evening talking about their future, making tentative plans and sharing dreams they'd never voiced before. Elena spoke of her desire to raise animals again, to have a garden where she could grow vegetables like her mother had taught her. Jake talked about his hope of eventually buying a small spread of his own, somewhere they could build the kind of life their parents had modeled for them. When Elena finally returned to the bunkhouse, it was late and the snow was falling again, adding to the white blanket that covered the ranch. Jake stood on his porch watching her go, Scout beside him with his tail wagging as if he understood that something wonderful had happened. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with diamond-bright sunlight reflecting off the snow. Jake woke with a sense of anticipation unlike anything he'd ever experienced. For the first time in years, he was eager not just for the day's work, but for life itself, for all the days and months and years that stretched ahead. When he arrived at the barn, Elena was already there, as always. But, now when their eyes met, everything was different. The careful politeness was gone, replaced by the warm intimacy of two people who had found each other against all odds. "Good morning," Elena said, and her smile held all the promise of their conversation the night before. "Good morning," Jake replied, and leaned down to kiss her cheek in full view of anyone who might be watching. It was a small gesture, but it announced to the world that something had changed between them. Jake Martinez, the quiet cowboy who had guarded his heart for 33 years, had finally found someone worth the risk of loving. And Elena Vesquez, who had lost everything once before, had discovered that sometimes life's greatest gifts came disguised as new beginnings. As they worked together that morning, checking on Daisy and her calf, mucking stalls, and preparing for another day of winter ranch work, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Elena's arrival had seemed like simple coincidence, a young woman looking for work who happened to stop at the right ranch at the right time. But Jake was beginning to understand that some things that looked like coincidence were really destiny, that some connections were too deep and immediate to be explained by chance alone. Elena had seen something in him that he hadn't known was there, the capacity for deep love, the desire for partnership, the dream of building something lasting with another person. In return, he had offered her what she needed most, a place to belong, work that honored her skills, and a man who recognized her worth from the very first day. Together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone, a love story written in the language of honest work, mutual respect, and the gradual unfolding of two hearts that had been waiting to find each other. The Triple Crown Ranch continued its ancient rhythms around them, cattle to be fed, fences to be mended, the endless cycle of seasons and work that connected them to the land and to each other. But now Jake and Elena moved through those rhythms as partners in every sense of the word, their love growing stronger with each shared task, each quiet conversation, each moment of understanding passed between them without the need for words. And, in the years to come, when people asked how they had known they were meant for each other, Jake and Elena would smile and remember that first day, when a beat-up Honda Civic had coughed its way up the ranch drive, bringing with it the greatest gift either of them had ever received, the chance to love and be loved in return, without reservation or pretense, as honest and enduring as the Montana sky above them. 3 weeks had passed since Elena arrived at the Triple Crown Ranch, and the rhythm of daily work had settled into something Jake had never experienced before. Each morning brought the anticipation of seeing her face, of working alongside someone who understood the value of honest labor and treated every task with respect. Elena had proven herself to be everything Jake had hoped and more. She learned quickly, worked without complaint, and brought a natural grace to even the most difficult jobs. The other ranch hands had quickly accepted her, impressed by her willingness to tackle any challenge and her genuine interest in learning from their experience. But it was the small moments that affected Jake most deeply. The way Elena hummed softly while grooming the horses. How she always stopped to pet Scout when he came running to greet her. The careful attention she paid when Jake explained something new, her dark eyes focused completely on his words. On this particular morning, Jake was teaching Elena how to properly shoe a horse. They stood in the barn with Thunder, an old gelding who was patient with inexperienced handlers. Elena watched intently as Jake demonstrated the process, asking thoughtful questions about the angle of the hoof and the proper way to drive the nails. The key is to work with the horse, not against him, Jake explained, running his hand along Thunder's leg to keep him calm. If you're nervous or rushed, he'll feel it and get anxious too. Elena nodded, then stepped forward to try it herself. Jake watched as she approached Thunder with the same gentle confidence she showed with all the animals. She spoke to the horse in Spanish, her voice soothing and musical. Thunder's ears perked forward, and he stood perfectly still as she picked up his hoof. "That's it," Jake said softly. "You've got the right touch." As Elena worked, Jake found himself studying her hands. They were small but strong, with calluses forming where the tools rubbed against her palms. These were working hands now, hands that were adapting to ranch life just as their owner was. But there was still something delicate about them, something that spoke of the gentle upbringing she'd received from parents who valued kindness as much as hard work. When Elena finished shoeing Thunder's front hooves, she stood and wiped her hands on her jeans. A strand of hair had escaped from her ponytail and fallen across her face. Without thinking, Jake reached out to brush it away. The moment his fingers touched her cheek, time seemed to stop. Elena's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. Jake's hand lingered for just a second too long, his rough fingertips gentle against her soft skin. Then, reality crashed back, and he jerked his hand away as if he'd been burned. "Sorry," he mumbled, heat flooding his face. There was." "It's okay," Elena said softly, her own cheeks pink. "Thank you." They stood there for a moment in awkward silence, the air between them charged with something neither was ready to acknowledge. Thunder snorted softly, breaking the spell, and they both turned their attention back to the horse. The rest of the morning passed without incident, but Jake couldn't stop thinking about those few seconds when he'd touched Elena's face. Her skin had been even softer than he'd imagined, and the way she'd looked at him, there had been something in her eyes, a warmth that went beyond mere friendliness. During lunch, Elena sat with the other ranch hands, laughing at their stories and sharing tales of her own family's farm. Jake watched from across the yard, noting how easily she fit in with the group. She had a gift for making people feel comfortable, for finding common ground even with the gruffest cowboys. "She's something special, that one," said Bill Martinez, an older hand who'd worked the ranch for 20 years. "Reminds me of my Maria when she was young, all fire and determination, but with a heart soft as butter." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Bill had been married to his wife for 35 years, and the love between them was evident in every glance they shared. Jake had always envied that connection, the way some people found their perfect match and built a life together. After lunch, Mrs. Henderson approached Jake with a request. "I need someone to take Elena into town this afternoon," she said. "She needs to open a bank account and pick up some supplies. Would you mind driving her in?" Jake's heart jumped. An afternoon alone with Elena, away from the ranch and the watching eyes of the other hands, felt both exciting and terrifying. "Sure," he managed. "No problem." An hour later, Jake was helping Elena into his pickup truck. She'd changed from her work clothes into a simple dress, nothing fancy, just a blue cotton dress with small white flowers. But, to Jake, she looked more beautiful than any woman he'd ever seen. The drive to town took 30 minutes along winding mountain roads. At first they rode in comfortable silence, the radio playing softly in the background. Elena gazed out at the scenery, pointing out hawks circling overhead and commenting on the changing colors of the leaves. "I love this time of year," she said. "Everything is preparing for winter, but there's still so much beauty before the cold comes." "It's my favorite season too," Jake replied. "Autumn feels honest, you know? No pretense, just what it is." Elena turned to look at him, a small smile playing at her lips. "You always say exactly what you mean, don't you? I like that about you." Jake felt that familiar warmth in his chest whenever Elena said something kind about him. He wasn't used to compliments, wasn't sure how to respond to them. "Don't see much point in saying things you don't mean," he said finally. "My father was the same way," Elena said. "He said words were precious, you shouldn't waste them on lies or empty flattery." They talked about their families during the rest of the drive. Elena shared more stories about growing up on her family's farm, the traditions her parents had passed down from their own childhoods in Mexico. Jake found himself talking more than usual, telling Elena about his father's dream of expanding their farm, the plans they'd made together before cancer changed everything. "He sounds like he was a wonderful man," Elena said when Jake finished describing his father's final months. "He was," Jake replied. "He would have liked you. Would have appreciated your way with animals, your respect for the land." Elena's smile was soft and understanding. "I think I would have liked him too." In town, Jake waited while Elena conducted her business at the bank. He stood outside on the sidewalk, watching her through the window as she spoke with the bank manager. Even in this unfamiliar setting, Elena carried herself with dignity and confidence. She might be new to town, but she wasn't intimidated by the formal surroundings. When she emerged from the bank, Elena's face was bright with satisfaction. "All done," she announced. "Now I officially exist in Montana." They walked down Main Street together, Elena admiring the storefronts and Jake seeing his hometown through her eyes. She was charmed by the old-fashioned barbershop, intrigued by the antique store's window display, and delighted by the bookstore's selection of local history. At the feed store, Elena insisted on carrying her own bags of horse treats and supplements. Jake watched her interact with old Pete Williams, the store owner, who was notoriously gruff with strangers. Within minutes, Elena had him smiling and sharing stories about his own horses. "You've got a way with people," Jake observed as they loaded supplies into the truck. "My mother always said you catch more flies with honey than vinegar," Elena replied. "Most people are good at heart, they just need to feel seen and respected." On the drive back to the ranch, they stopped at a roadside stand where a local farmer was selling apples and pumpkins. Elena chose a bag of apples for the horses and a small pumpkin that caught her eye. The farmer, an elderly man with kind eyes, refused her payment. "Welcome to Montana, young lady," he said with a tip of his hat. "Any friend of Jake's is a friend of mine." As they drove away, Elena looked puzzled. "How did he know we were friends?" Jake felt his face warm. "Small town," he said. "People talk." "What do they say?" Elena asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Jake hesitated. He'd heard the whispers, the speculation about the new ranch hand and the quiet cowboy who'd been showing her around. Some of the talk was innocent enough, remarks about Elena's skill with animals, praise for her work ethic. But there had been other comments too, knowing looks and nudged elbows when Jake and Elena worked together. "Mostly that you're good at the job," Jake said finally. "That you're fitting in well." Elena nodded, but Jake sensed she knew there was more to it than that. Small towns were the same everywhere. Any change in routine became fodder for gossip, especially when it involved an attractive young woman and an eligible bachelor. When they arrived back at the ranch, the sun was beginning to set. Elena insisted on helping Jake unload the supplies, even though he could have done it himself in half the time. They worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same box or bag. "Thank you for today," Elena said when they finished. "For driving me to town, for everything. It meant a lot to have someone with me." "Any time," Jake replied, meaning it completely. Elena smiled, then surprised him by rising on her toes to kiss his cheek. It was just a quick, friendly gesture, the kind of thank you kiss that meant nothing more than gratitude. But, to Jake, it felt like everything. "Good night," Elena whispered, then turned and walked toward the bunkhouse. Jake stood frozen for several seconds, his hand rising unconsciously to touch the spot where Elena's lips had briefly met his skin. The kiss had lasted barely a moment, but he could still feel the warmth of it, still smell the faint scent of her shampoo. Scout came trotting over, tail wagging, and Jake knelt to pet him. "What do you think, boy?" he asked softly. "Am I losing my mind?" Scout just looked at him with intelligent brown eyes, as if to say that some questions were too complicated for dogs to answer. That evening, Jake found it impossible to concentrate on his usual routines. He tried reading a book about cattle breeding, but his mind kept drifting to Elena. He attempted to repair a broken bridle, but his hands shook too much to thread the leather properly. Finally, he gave up and went out onto his porch to think. The bunkhouse was dark now, Elena presumably asleep after her first trip to town. Jake wondered what she thought of the community she was becoming part of, whether she could see herself building a life here. The question made his heart race, because somewhere in the wondering was a deeper hope, that if Elena did stay, she might consider building that life with him. Jake had never thought of himself as the marrying kind. He'd dated a few women over the years, but nothing serious had ever developed. He'd assumed it was because of his quiet nature, his preference for solitude and simple pleasures. But he was beginning to understand that it hadn't been about his personality at all. It had been about not finding the right person, someone who appreciated the same things he did and shared his values. Elena seemed to understand him in a way that no one ever had before. She didn't try to change his quiet nature or push him to be more social. Instead, she seemed to value their conversations, to find meaning in the silences they shared. When they worked together, it felt like a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. The thought of affection made Jake's chest tighten. Was that what this was? This constant awareness of Elena's presence, this desire to protect and provide for her, this way his whole day seemed brighter when she smiled, was this what falling in love felt like? Jake had heard people describe love in grand terms, as something that struck like lightning or swept you away like a flood. But what he felt for Elena was quieter than that, steadier. It was more like the way water slowly wore away stone, gentle but persistent, changing everything gradually until one day you looked around and realized the landscape was completely different. He thought about the kiss on his cheek, Elena's casual gesture of gratitude. She probably didn't know the effect it had on him, how that simple touch had sent electricity through his entire body. Jake wondered if she felt any of the connection that seemed so obvious to him, or if he was reading too much into her kindness. The truth was, Jake had no experience with this kind of situation. He'd never felt this way about anyone before, and he had no idea how to proceed. Should he tell Elena how he felt? Should he wait and see if her feelings developed in the same direction? Should he try to show her through his actions, letting his care speak louder than words? His father had always said that the best approach to any problem was the straightforward one, but this didn't feel like the kind of problem you could solve with honest work and practical thinking. This was about the heart, about hope and fear and the terrible vulnerability of caring about someone who might not care about you in the same way. As Jake prepared for bed that night, he made a decision. He would continue to be himself around Elena, honest, hardworking, respectful. If something was meant to develop between them, it would happen naturally. And, if not, well, at least he would have the privilege of working alongside her and learning from her generous spirit. But, even as he settled into sleep, Jake couldn't quite convince himself to be patient. Every day that passed felt precious now, every conversation a gift. He was a man who had always been content to let life happen to him, but Elena's presence was awakening something more active in his nature, a desire to reach out and claim happiness rather than simply wait for it to arrive. Outside his window, the Montana wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of coming winter and the promise of change. Jake closed his eyes and let himself imagine a future where Elena stayed at the ranch, where their partnership deepened into something more permanent and precious. It was a dangerous dream, but, for the first time in his careful, guarded life, Jake Martinez was willing to risk his heart on the possibility of love. Jake Martinez had been working cattle for 15 years, ever since he turned 18 and left his family's small farm in Texas. The sun had carved deep lines around his eyes, and his hands were rough from rope burns and fence mending. He was the kind of man who spoke more to horses than to people, finding comfort in the quiet rhythm of ranch life. The Triple Crown Ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of Montana grassland, where Jake worked as the lead ranch hand. He lived in a small cabin on the property, content with his simple life of dawn-to-dusk work and the company of his blue heeler dog, Scout. Most folks in town knew Jake as the quiet cowboy who tipped his hat politely but rarely stayed for conversation. On a crisp October morning, Jake was repairing a section of fence near the main road when a beat-up Honda Civic came sputtering down the gravel drive. The car's exhaust pipe was hanging loose, dragging sparks across the rocks. Jake watched as it pulled up to the ranch house, curious about who might be visiting the Hendersons at such an early hour. A young woman stepped out of the car, and Jake felt something shift in his chest. She wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, but there was something graceful about the way she moved. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and, when she turned toward the ranch house, Jake caught sight of her profile. What struck him most was not her beauty, though she was certainly pretty. It was the determined set of her shoulders, the way she squared them before walking up to the front porch. This was someone who had faced hard times but hadn't let them break her spirit. Mrs. Henderson came out to greet the visitor, and Jake could hear bits of their conversation carried on the morning breeze. The young woman's name was Elena Vasquez, and she was looking for work. Her voice had a slight accent that Jake couldn't quite place, musical and warm even from a distance. Jake pretended to focus on the fence wire, but his eyes kept drifting toward the house. Elena was explaining something to Mrs. Henderson, gesturing with her hands as she spoke. There was passion in her movements, an eagerness that reminded Jake of a young horse ready to run. Mrs. Henderson nodded and pointed toward the barn, then, in Jake's direction. His heart quickened as he realized they might be discussing ranch work. The Triple Crown had been short-handed since old Pete retired last month, and they'd been struggling to keep up with all the tasks that needed doing. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Henderson walked over to where Jake was working, Elena following a few steps behind. Up close, Jake could see that Elena's eyes were the color of coffee with just a touch of cream. She had freckles across her nose and a small scar on her chin that somehow made her more beautiful, not less. "Jake, I'd like you to meet Elena," Mrs. Henderson said. "She's going to be helping us out around here. I was hoping you could show her the ropes, teach her what needs doing." Jake touched the brim of his hat and nodded. "Ma'am," he said to Elena, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Elena smiled, and Jake felt that shift in his chest again, stronger this time. "Thank you," she said. "I'm eager to learn. I've worked with animals before, but never on a ranch this size." Her accent, Jake realized, was Spanish. It gave her words a musical quality that made even simple statements sound like poetry. He found himself wanting to hear more of her voice, to understand the story behind her presence here. "Where did you work with animals before?"
Mrs. Henderson asked. My family had a small farm in New Mexico, Elena explained. We raised goats and chickens, grew vegetables. I helped my father with everything until. She paused, her smile faltering slightly. Until we lost the farm last year. Jake saw pain flicker across her features, quickly hidden but unmistakable. He recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror after his own father died, when keeping the family farm became impossible and he'd had to sell everything. I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Henderson said gently. But your experience will be valuable here. Jake can show you around today, and we'll start you off with some basic tasks. You'll be staying in the bunkhouse behind the main barn. After Mrs. Henderson left, Jake and Elena stood in awkward silence for a moment. Scout came trotting over, tail wagging, and immediately took to Elena. She knelt down to pet him, laughing as he tried to lick her face. He's beautiful, she said, scratching behind Scout's ears. What's his name? Scout, Jake replied, watching how gently she handled his dog. In his experience, you could tell a lot about a person by how they treated animals. Hello, Scout, Elena murmured, and the dog practically melted under her attention. You're a good boy, aren't you? Jake cleared his throat. Should probably show you around the place, he said. Get you familiar with how things work here. They spent the morning touring the ranch. Jake showed Elena the different pastures, explained how they rotated the cattle to prevent overgrazing, and demonstrated how to check the water troughs. She asked thoughtful questions and took mental notes of everything he told her. At the horse barn, Elena's face lit up when she saw the animals. She approached them with the same gentle confidence she'd shown with Scout, letting them sniff her hand before attempting to pet them. This one's Rosie, Jake said, introducing her to a chestnut mare. She's gentle but smart. Good horse for someone learning to work cattle. Elena stroked Rosie's neck, murmuring something in Spanish that Jake couldn't understand but that seemed to calm the horse. My father always said horses could sense your heart, she said. If you're honest with them, they'll be honest with you. Your father sounds like a wise man, Jake said. He was, Elena replied softly. He taught me that hard work and honesty were the only things that really mattered in life. Everything else was just decoration. They continued the tour, checking feed supplies and examining equipment that would need maintenance before winter. Elena proved to be a quick learner, asking practical questions about each task. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, and she paid attention to details that many newcomers missed. During lunch break, they sat on hay bales outside the barn. Elena had brought a simple meal, a sandwich and an apple, while Jake shared some of the jerky he'd made himself. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the cattle graze in the distance. Why did you choose ranch work? Elena asked suddenly. Jake considered the question while he chewed. Most people didn't ask him personal questions, and he wasn't used to explaining himself. Grew up on a farm, he said finally. After my dad died, had to sell it. But I couldn't imagine doing anything else. You must miss it, Elena said. Having your own place. Every day, Jake admitted, surprised at his own honesty. But this is good work. Hendersons are fair people. And the land. He gestured toward the rolling hills. Land doesn't care who owns it. It just needs taking care of. Elena nodded as if she understood completely. That's how my father felt about our farm. He said the land wasn't really ours, we were just its caretakers for a while. They finished lunch and returned to work. Jake taught Elena how to properly mend fence, showing her how to stretch wire tight and secure it with the right tension. She watched his hands carefully, mimicking his movements until she could do it herself. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself stealing glances at Elena. There was something about her presence that made the familiar work feel different, more meaningful somehow. She didn't chatter nervously like some people did when they were learning something new. Instead, she focused completely on each task, giving it the respect it deserved. When they moved cattle from one pasture to another, Elena proved she knew how to read animal behavior. She positioned herself correctly to guide the herd's movement,
never pushing too hard or moving too fast. The cattle responded to her natural confidence. "You've done this before," Jake observed. "With goats," Elena said with a smile. "But animals are animals. They want to feel safe and know where they're going." Jake nodded, impressed by her understanding. Many experienced ranch hands never learned to read animals the way Elena seemed to instinctively. As evening approached, they finished securing the cattle in their new pasture. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Elena stood watching the sunset, her face peaceful in the golden light. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "Thank you for today. For teaching me." "You're a natural," Jake replied. "Don't think you'll need much teaching." Elena turned to look at him, and, for a moment, their eyes met. Jake felt something pass between them, an understanding, a recognition. It was as if she saw something in him that most people missed, just as he saw something special in her. "I should get settled in the bunkhouse," Elena said finally, breaking the spell. "Sure," Jake said. "Tomorrow we'll work on horseback riding if you're up for it. Most of the cattle work requires being mounted." "I'd like that," Elena said. "Good night, Jake." "Good night, Elena." Jake watched her walk toward the bunkhouse, Scout trotting alongside her as if he'd already decided where his loyalties lay. He stood there long after she'd disappeared inside, looking up at the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Something had changed today, though Jake couldn't put his finger on exactly what. The ranch was the same, the work was the same, but everything felt different. It was as if someone had adjusted the focus on a photograph, making details he'd never noticed suddenly sharp and clear. He thought about the way Elena had handled the animals, the thoughtful questions she'd asked, the genuine interest she'd shown in learning each task properly. But it was more than her competence that impressed him. It was the quiet strength she carried, the way she faced new challenges without complaint or fear. Jake had always been content with his solitary life. He'd convinced himself that he didn't need much beyond good work, honest pay, and the companionship of his dog. But watching Elena today had awakened something in him that he'd thought was permanently buried, a longing for connection, for someone to share the simple pleasures and daily struggles of ranch life. As he walked back to his cabin, Jake found himself planning tomorrow's lessons. He wanted to teach Elena everything he knew, to share with her the skills his father had passed down to him. Not just because Mrs. Henderson had asked him to, but because he genuinely wanted Elena to succeed here, to find a home at the Triple Crown Ranch. Inside his cabin, Jake prepared a simple dinner and sat down to eat. Usually, he enjoyed the quiet of evening, the sense of a day's work well done. But tonight the silence felt different, not peaceful, but empty. He found himself wondering what Elena was doing, whether she was settling in comfortably, whether she felt as unsettled by their day together as he did. Jake had never been good with words. He'd learned early that actions mattered more than speech, that you proved yourself through work rather than talk. But something about Elena made him want to try to express the thoughts and feelings he usually kept locked away. He thought about her father's advice, that horses could sense your heart, that honesty was what mattered most. Jake had always prided himself on being honest in his work, but he'd never extended that honesty to his emotional life. He kept his feelings carefully controlled, shared them with no one. But today, when Elena had asked why he chose ranch work, he'd found himself being more honest than usual. Something about her presence had made it feel safe to reveal a small piece of himself. The way she'd nodded, as if she truly understood, had encouraged him in a way he hadn't expected. Outside, he could hear the cattle settling for the night, the soft lowing that meant all was well. It was a sound that had comforted him for years, but tonight it seemed to be welcoming a new presence to the ranch. Jake wondered if Elena could hear it too, if she understood the language of animals well enough to know what contentment sounded like. Before bed, Jake stepped out onto his small porch and looked across the ranch yard toward the bunkhouse. A single light glowed in one of the windows, Elena's room. The sight filled him with an unexpected sense of rightness, as if a piece that had been missing from the ranch's puzzle had finally been put in place. He stood there for several minutes, not really thinking about anything specific, just absorbing the feeling of this new reality. Tomorrow would bring more work, more lessons, more time spent in Elena's company. The prospect filled him with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Jake had spent so long focusing on the past, missing his father, mourning the loss of his family's farm, that he'd forgotten how to look forward to anything. But Elena's arrival had stirred something in him, a sense that the future might hold possibilities he hadn't considered. As he prepared for bed, Jake caught himself whistling softly, something he rarely did. He paused, surprised by the sound, then smiled slightly and continued the tune. It was a song his mother used to sing while she worked in the kitchen, a gentle melody that spoke of hope and new beginnings. For the first time in years, Jake Martinez went to sleep thinking not about what he'd lost, but about what he might yet find. And, in the morning, he would wake eager to continue teaching Elena Vasquez the ways of ranch life, never knowing that she was teaching him something equally valuable in return: how to open his heart to the possibility of love.